This is our 21st study in the series on Bible Doctrine, and I'd like to speak to you on the subject of Supralapsarianism. In our previous study, I explained the meaning of Lapsarianism, distinguishing between two basic views. First, that of sub- or Infralapsarianism, which refers to God's decree of the fall before that of election, simply meaning the human race was viewed in sin when the Father set his love upon the elect. And then there's that of Supralapsarianism. This refers to God's decree of election before that of the fall, meaning the human race was viewed without sin when the Father set his love upon the elect. For this study, I like to share some of the reasons I believe Supralapsarianism is the correct view of God's decree of election. And first, the teachings of Paul reveal it. The whole of Romans chapter 9 sets out the Supralapsarian framework quite clearly. And of course, that's something I've already expounded in our previous studies. But for the purpose of this study, I wish to highlight only one part of Romans chapter 9, which speaks of Paul's analogy of the potter and the clay. And I'd like to show you from that analogy how it is aligned with Supralapsarianism. In Romans chapter 9, verses 21 through 23, the apostle depicts God the Father as the potter, with the clay serving to illustrate the entire human race as a pure lump of humanity, that is, without viewing them in sin. The potter has power over the clay of the same lump to make one vessel unto honor and another unto dishonor. Now notice, the vessels unto honor are the objects of God's special love, the elect, whereas the vessels unto dishonor are the objects of less love, the non-elect. At this point in God's decree, I'd like you to notice the grace and wrath of God are not yet manifested, because sin has not yet been decreed. However, after electing some and reprobating others, it then pleased the Father to determine how the human race would come into existence. Watch this. What if God decreed to bring the human race into existence by placing them into a time continuum and into a purpose-built world? What if God the Father then decreed to establish a covenant of works with Adam, appointing him the covenant head of the human race? And what if the Father then decreed to arrange the fall, thereby bringing the entire human race into sin and condemnation? What if the Father then decreed to make the vessels of dishonor the vessels of wrath, leaving them to themselves in their sins, fitting them to destruction? And what if the Father then decreed to save his elect people from their sins, giving them to his Son, appointing him to serve as their Redeemer, thereby making them the vessels of mercy prepared unto glory? Do you see, my friends, how the teachings of Paul set forth the supralapsarian framework of God's electing love? Now, while one may disagree with this interpretation of Romans chapter 9, yet it's disingenuous to assert those who subscribe to Supralapsarianism have no scriptural support for their teachings. That's simply not true. Indeed, as I've just shown to you by way of this diagram, I believe the only consistent interpretation of Paul's teachings in Romans chapter 9 is that of the Supralapsarian view. I'd like you to know that this is not a teaching that is based on pure speculation, neither is it the exercise of mere human logic. Rather, the Supralapsarian framework is based on the teachings of Holy Scripture. And this is the first reason I believe it is the correct view. Well, this brings me to a second reason I believe Supralapsarianism is the correct view. And that has to do with the order of vessels requiring it. I'll have you notice, according to Romans chapter 9, the human race is divided between vessels of honor on one side and the vessels of dishonor before they are made vessels of mercy and then the vessels of wrath. For just a moment, observe the notes on the diagram. They are first made the vessels of honor and the vessels of dishonor before they are made the vessels of mercy and the vessels of wrath. However, and please watch this carefully, according to the Supralapsarian view, the Father ordains the fall of the human race before setting his special love on anyone, which obviously requires the members of the human race to be made vessels of mercy before they are made vessels unto honor. Do you see? If it is from a sinful human race the Father chooses a people to himself, then that sinful people cannot be vessels unto honor at the initial point of God's election until they are first made the vessels of mercy by redeeming grace. Of course, this reverses the order set out by Paul in Romans chapter 9. Taking you back to the Supralapsarian framework, watch. Paul tells us the first thing the Father does with the human race is to set apart some as vessels unto honor, while setting aside the others as vessels unto dishonor. Now, the only way for some of these persons to be set apart as vessels unto honor at this initial stage of God's electing love is if they are not yet viewed in sin. Henceforth, it is only after the Father has made this initial choice that he therefore decrees the fall of man, according to which the vessels of dishonor are made the vessels of wrath, and the vessels of honor are made the vessels of mercy. Do you see the order? Again, if you go back to the Supralapsarian framework, if you subscribe to this framework, then you must reverse the order of Romans chapter 9, viewing the members of the human race to first be vessels of mercy before they are made vessels of honor. Whereas if you subscribe to the Supralapsarian framework, then you keep with the order of Romans chapter 9, viewing the members of the human race to be vessels unto honor before they are made vessels of mercy, and the others are made vessels of dishonor before they are made vessels of wrath. And so, my dear friends, I believe Supralapsarianism is the correct view of God's electing love because it keeps to the order of that which is taught by Paul in Romans chapter 9. Well, this brings me to a third reason why I believe Supralapsarianism is the correct view. It has to do with the motivating factor which calls for it. Now, by the motivating factor, I'm referring to that which has motivated the Father to elect some and reprobate others. According to Romans chapter 9, I like you to notice the love of God is viewed as the leading factor for both election and reprobation. Let me increase the size of the note so you can better see this on the screen. Watch this. When the Father envisioned the entire mass of the human race as one pure lump without sin, there was not at this point in his decree a reason for his saving grace and damning wrath to be manifested. Sin was not yet part of the equation. All that the Father did at this initial stage was to set apart some members of the human race as special objects of his love, while setting aside the others as objects of less love. There was in this initial stage of God's decree a variant degree of love exercised by the Father towards the elect and the non-elect. There was a special love for the elect, wherein he made them vessels unto honor, whereas there was less love for the non-elect, wherein he made them vessels unto dishonor. You see, all that is in view at this stage of God's decree is the measure of the Father's love towards the elect and the non-elect. There was not, at this point, any degree of hostility towards the members of the human race. And why would there be any hostility? Sin had not yet been decreed, and therefore there was no reason for hostility. Let me show you what I mean. Looking at Paul's explanation in Romans chapter 9, and this time I point you to verse 13, Paul says, as it is written, Jacob have I loved, but Esau have I hated. I've highlighted this verse on the screen. Notice, Jacob is used as a metaphor, representing the objects of God's special love, the elect. Whereas Esau is used as a metaphor to represent the objects of God's less love, the non-elect. But of course, you might then ask, how can you say God has any measure of love for Esau or for the non-elect, since we're clearly told in the text that God hates Esau? Well, the Greek word that's been translated hate may certainly carry with it this meaning of pure hatred in the sense of one's hostility and animosity towards another. Indeed, sometimes the Greek term is used in precisely that way, meaning to abhor or detest something or someone. However, and this is important to note, the same Greek term is also used as a simple measurement of one's affection for one thing over another. It simply means to love less, without any hostility playing a role. Let me give you an example of this. The same Greek term translated hate in Romans chapter 9, verse 13, is recorded also in Luke chapter 14, verse 26. These are the words of the Lord Jesus Christ. If any man come to me and hate not his father and mother and wife and children and brethren and sisters, yea, and his own life also, he cannot be my disciple. Do you see? Christ is not telling his people that they must nurture hostility towards their family members, detesting and abhorring them. Rather, he's saying they are to set a special love upon Christ, loving him supremely, while setting less love upon their family members, loving them less than Christ. Now, that's how Paul is using the term hate in Romans chapter 9, verse 13. He is showing how the Father, in the initial stage of his eternal decree, distinguished between the elect and the non-elect, based purely upon the measure of love he shows to the one more than the other. At this stage in the decree, sin was not a part of the equation, so neither was the saving grace or damning wrath of God, only the measurement of his love. Henceforth, the motivating factor in election and reprobation is not the saving grace or the damning wrath of God, but rather it is the love God extends to the two groups of the human race, a special love towards the elect and less love towards the non-elect. Is this not what the Lord himself says to Jeremiah? In Jeremiah chapter 31 and verse 3, watch this. The Lord hath appeared of old unto me, saying, Yea, I have loved thee with an everlasting love. Therefore, with loving kindness have I drawn thee. Do you see, my friends? The Father draws his people by grace or by his loving kindness, which is motivated or based upon his everlasting love. It is the everlasting love of God which motivates him to draw his people to himself with his loving kindness or his grace and mercy. We find the same thing in John chapter 3 and verse 16. For God the Father so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. Do you see? The motivating factor for the Father giving his only begotten Son to redeem his people from their sins is the everlasting love he set upon them when making them the objects of his special love. Now, What has been said about the motivating factor in election holds true for the motivating factor in reprobation. Please watch this. If the love of the Father in election is magnified by His grace to save His people from their sins, then watch this. The less love the Father has towards the non-elect in reprobation is intensified by His wrath when leaving them in their sins and fitting them to destruction. Don't you see? The love of the Father is the motivating factor which leads to the grace God extends to the elect, as well as the wrath He pours out upon the non-elect. Which is the third reason I believe Supralapsarianism is the correct view. Well, this brings me to a fourth reason I believe Supralapsarianism is the correct view. And this has to do with the doctrine of redemption necessitating it. Just a quick explanation on this word redemption. The word redemption refers to the action of regaining possession of something in exchange for payment. I'll say it again. This word redemption refers to the action of regaining possession of something in exchange for payment. It's derived from a Latin word which means to buy back. For example, in Revelation chapter 5 and verse 9, this word redeemed is used by the 4 beasts and the 24 elders who fell down before the Lamb, singing a new song, saying, "Thou art worthy to take the book and to open the seals thereof. For thou wast slain, and hast redeemed us to God by thy blood, out of every kindred and tongue and people and nation." Please notice carefully. If redemption is regaining possession of something in exchange for payment, then the only way for Christ to buy back the elect to the Father is if the Father previously owned them prior to their sins. I don't want to go too quickly through this explanation. Please watch carefully the diagram. Redemption is not a payment made for the initial ownership of a possession, but rather, redemption is a payment made for the regaining of a possession that was already owned. Henceforth, the Father must have initially owned His elect people prior to them being sold in sin, in order for the Son to buy back or redeem or regain the Father's possession which was previously owned by Him. I hope you can see the point that I'm making here, my dear friends. The only Lapsarian view which supports the doctrine of redemption is Supralapsarianism. The Father viewing the human race without sin, setting apart a people as objects of his special love, after which he arranged for the human race to be brought into existence under the headship of Adam, and therefore his elect people sold in sin. After which the Father drew up the plan of redemption to buy back his elect people from their sins by redeeming them through the work of Christ. However, if the doctrine of redemption is lined up with the sub-Lapsarian view of God's decree, watch this. At no point does the Father own the elect prior to their sins. And therefore, how can the Father redeem that which he never initially owned? Yes, my dear friends, I believe Supralapsarianism is the correct view because the Father cannot redeem the elect from their sins unless he owns them prior to their sins. Okay, I hope you followed so far in the reasons I've given on why I believe Supralapsarianism is the correct view. I have one more reason I want to highlight for you, and it has to do with the election of angels, which only affirms the Supralapsarian framework. Taking you back to the framework of sovereign grace, let me try to give an explanation of the angels in connection with the humans. There are two species of spirit beings created by God: angels and humans. Now please listen to me carefully. Both species are made in the image of God. They are spirit beings, and therefore both species are capable of having a personal relationship with Him. While we seldom think of the angels in this way, the Scriptures certainly bear testimony of the fact. It shouldn't surprise us, therefore, my friends, to learn from the Scriptures that God has elected and reprobated members of the angelic host in a similar way that He has elected and reprobated members of the human race. For example, when writing to Timothy, the Apostle Paul makes reference to the elect angels. In 1 Timothy chapter 5 and verse 21, Paul wrote, "I charge thee before God and the Lord Jesus Christ and the elect angels." Likewise, Jude makes reference to the angels, only he speaks about the reprobate or non-elect angels. In Jude verse 6, "The angels which kept not their first estate, but left their own habitation, he hath reserved in everlasting chains under darkness unto the judgment of the great day." And so, we have a reference by Paul to the elect angels, which kept their first estate, having been created in righteousness. And we have a reference by Jude to the non-elect angels, which kept not their first estate, having been created in righteousness, but fell in sin. The question which follows then is this: did God decree to elect and reprobate the angels before decreeing some of them would fall in sin? Or after decreeing some of them would fall in sin? Well, God must have elected and reprobated the angels before decreeing they would fall in sin. How do we know this? Listen to me carefully. God could not have viewed the angelic host in sin when electing some as objects of his special love, for then they would be in need of salvation if God viewed them in sin. And God has never provided for the angels salvation. You see, the only possible framework around which God elected the angels is that of Supralapsarianism. He must have viewed them all without sin when he made this choice of setting some apart as objects of love, others apart as objects of less love. And then, after making that choice, he chooses to bring them into the world when the non-elect angels fall in sin, but the elect angels retain their righteousness. Henceforth, what we ultimately have, according to the master plan of God for the ages, is this. Let me give you the overview of it. Watch this. From eternity, the first thing God envisioned and decreed was the whole mass of the angelic host, viewing them without sin, setting some apart as objects of special love, making them vessels unto honor, and setting the others aside as objects of less love, making them vessels unto dishonor. In like manner, the second thing God envisioned and created, envisioned and decreed, was the whole mass of the human race, also viewing them without sin, setting some apart as objects of special love, making them vessels unto honor, and setting the others aside as objects of less love, making them vessels unto dishonor. It then pleased God to determine how the angelic host would be brought into existence. It would be in a time continuum and a purpose-built world. All of the angels were made in righteousness and true holiness. The elect angels remained in their righteous condition, whereas the non-elect angels fell into sin. It then pleased the Father to determine how the human race would be brought into existence. They would be brought under the headship of Adam and therefore in sin. The Father would devise a plan of salvation for the objects of his special love, making them vessels of mercy and vessels of gold and silver, whereas he would leave in their sins the objects of less love, making them the vessels of wrath and the vessels of wood and earth. I hope you can see, my dear friends, the only possible framework around which God elected and reprobated the members of the angelic host is Supralapsarianism, which affirms this is the same framework around which he elected and reprobated the members of the human race. And so, for this study, I have sought to show you why I believe Supralapsarianism is the correct view of God's decree of election. And just to review in closing, first, Supralapsarianism is the correct view because it is clearly revealed to us in the Scriptures. Second, Supralapsarianism is the correct view because it keeps in the right order the vessels of honor and the vessels of dishonor before they are made vessels of mercy and vessels of wrath. Third, Supralapsarianism is the correct view because the motivation of God in election and reprobation is love, not grace, not wrath, not justice, but his love. Fourth, Supralapsarianism is the correct view because the Father can only redeem the elect from their sins if he owns them prior to their sins. And fifth, Supralapsarianism is the correct view because it is in precisely the same way the Father elected and reprobated the angelic host. And that is my study for you. Why I believe Supralapsarianism is the correct view. And I want to leave with you these considerations, trusting the Lord will lead you into all truth. Until we meet again for our next study, may you know the blessings of the Lord.